Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. Coming at you today with a deep dive into cottagecore and its relationship to the queer community, particularly to sapphic women. But before we get started, I'd like to remind you all to like and subscribe and stick around if you're into political commentary, LGBTQIA+ issues and identities, as well as deep dives into history, fashion, feminism, and culture, because that is what we do on this channel. In this video, we're going to be exploring what cottagecore is, how it became popular in the early 2020s, and the fascinating, often queer history that lies beneath its quaint exterior. So grab a cup of tea, get cozy, and let's get started. What is cottagecore? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, cottagecore is an internet aesthetic that romanticizes rural life. It celebrates the countryside with an emphasis on low-tech analog tasks like baking, gardening, cooking, wildcrafting, foraging, crochet, knitting, and sewing your own clothes. It idealizes slow living with a return to nature and traditionally feminine skills. It's about escaping the hustle and bustle of modern life and embracing the charm of a pastoral existence. Picture yourself in a cozy cottage surrounded by nature, baking bread, gardening, and perhaps even raising chickens. This is the essence of cottagecore. But cottagecore is more than just an aesthetic. It's a cultural response to the stresses of modernity. In an age of constant connectivity, fast fashion, and urbanization, cottagecore offers a retreat into a world where time slows down and everything is just a bit more simple and predictable. The aesthetic often includes soft, muted colors, vintage fashion, and activities like knitting, baking, and crafting, as I mentioned before. There are different subgenres of cottagecore, and each one comes with its own iteration of decor, fashion, and filters. To give you some examples, we have fairy cottagecore, which is meant to give similar vibes to a storybook cottage in a fairy tale. It's characterized by natural colors, a soft romantic tone, and a touch of whimsy and little girl nostalgia. Then we have vintage cottagecore, featuring cozy environments that evoke a rustic feel, like rooms with rough wooden floors, brick walls, stone fireplaces, antique teacups, and handcrafted items. Typically a bit warmer and darker, the color palette for vintage cottagecore features tans, browns, and deep reds. Light cottagecore, on the other hand, is a more soothing and minimalist version of the aesthetic, and it's meant to be soft and inviting. It features clean lines and muted colors with simple furniture and lots of natural light. Then we have dark cottagecore, which is my personal favorite. This is the witchy autumnal version of the aesthetic, and it features dark filters, rustic details, supernatural elements, and a touch of creepiness. It's a bit gritty and macabre, kind of like Baba Yaga's cottage, and you'll find items that feature mystical symbols like the moon phases, pentagrams, and skulls. You'll also find floral patterns on dark backgrounds, chandeliers, wooden shutters, dripping candles, antique mirrors, and potion bottles. While its modern version started out as an internet aesthetic on Tumblr, Instagram, and TikTok, cottagecore manifests into the real world mostly through fashion and home decor. It's aspirational in the sense that it glorifies living slowly and intentionally in a world that's increasingly fast-paced, high-tech, and digital. Though its simplicity and rustic nature harkens back to 19th century farmers and peasant life, in order to actually live out this fantasy, you have to have enough resources at your disposal in order to consciously opt out of modern life. Baking pies from scratch with antique crockery is expensive, not just in terms of ingredients and resources, but also in the sense that it takes a lot of time that a lot of us just don't have. Paradoxically, cottagecore is a fantasy that lives primarily in online spaces, and it was made popular through the internet. Yet it pushes back against the very thing that allows it to thrive, and as viewers and consumers of the aesthetic, we're meant to transcend the digital infrastructure that props it up and enter into a world of rustic fairy tale fantasy. Cottagecore has been around for a while, I'll get to that later, but the trend gained significant traction on platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Pinterest, where people shared their love for this idyllic lifestyle. It became especially popular during the COVID-19 pandemic when people were craving comfort, stability, predictability, and a return to simpler times. The cottagecore trend of the early 2020s. Cottagecore's popularity as an internet aesthetic soared in 2020. At the onset of the pandemic, life as we knew it was upended almost overnight, as we all remember. Lockdowns, social distancing, and the shift to remote work and virtual communication left many feeling isolated, anxious, and disconnected from the world around us. In this context, the appeal of cottagecore, a lifestyle that emphasizes peace, solitude, and a return to simpler times, became a powerful antidote to the chaos and uncertainty that we were all feeling at the time. With more time spent at home, a lot of us picked up some old-timey activities that provided comfort, a sense of accomplishment, and a way to pass the time. Raise your hand if you were one of the sourdough bread bakers. In November of 2020, I started reproducing historical garments by hand, and I taught myself how to sew like a Georgian mantua maker just so I could make this very specific Marie Antoinette dress, which also has its roots in cottagecore, but I'll get to that later. These were more than just hobbies. They were acts of self-care and mindfulness, which allowed us to reconnect with the beauty and satisfaction of doing things slowly. They offered a way to feel grounded and in control during a time when so much felt uncertain. They also offered a radical break from the work grind. A lot of us, especially millennials of my generation, have spent our entire careers working really, really hard to just barely scrape by. A lot of us were graduating school and entering the workforce during the recession of the late 2000s and early 2010s, and we've spent our entire careers thus far just basically being on call 24/7 because we're haunted by a scarcity mentality when it comes to jobs. For those of us who were fortunate enough to be able to stay at home during the pandemic, being forced to slow down allowed us to take space and breathe and to derive a sense of accomplishment from something else besides work. For a lot of us, this was liberating and maybe even slightly validating. The pandemic also brought to light the drawbacks of modern urban living: overcrowded cities, the stress of constant productivity, and the alienation that can come from a life dominated by screens and technology. Cottagecore, with its emphasis on slowing down, reconnecting with nature, and appreciating the small things in life, offered an alternative vision, one where happiness wasn't tied to consumerism or hustle culture, but to simplicity, sustainability, and self-sufficiency. Platforms like TikTok saw the rise of cottagecore creators who showcased everything from homemade bread recipes to DIY crafts, vintage fashion hauls, and tours of their beautifully decorated spaces. These posts and videos featured mostly white women crafting, baking, walking through the woods, pressing flowers, harvesting from their herb gardens, tea and vintage teacups, reading poetry, and wearing frilly aprons, dresses, and straw hats. All of this was incredibly appealing at a time when we were locked inside and only allowed out for exercise and essential errands, and doubly so if you happen to live in a cramped urban apartment with roommates and the only places available for you to walk were city sidewalks and the occasional green space. Cottagecore became more than just an aesthetic. It became a way of life that people aspired to, even if only in their imaginations. While some saw cottagecore as merely an aesthetic trend, for many it became a meaningful way of life, a path toward finding peace and purpose in the midst of a global crisis. The pandemic forced us all to slow down, to reevaluate what truly matters, and for those who embraced cottagecore, it was a way to cultivate a sense of connection, both to the natural world and to a way of living that felt more authentic and fulfilling. By 2021, cottagecore videos on TikTok had 6.6 billion views and had started a Twitter war. More on that later too. Though cottagecore content was largely being posted and followed by young white people, one of its earlier influencers was a 51-year-old black woman named Paula Sutton, whose Instagram account @HillhouseVintage had racked up almost 500,000 followers during the pandemic. Sutton posted tableaus of her posing in gingham dresses and straw hats amidst the antique furniture of her Georgian home in the rolling hills of the English countryside, and her content became so popular that a book called Hill House Living was published in October 2021 that was marketed as a gorgeous guide to the simple pleasures of cottage living. There are a few cottagecore accounts that are run by black influencers like @CottagecoreBlackFolks on Instagram and Enchanted Noir on TikTok, but the space unfortunately remains a largely white, able-bodied, and Eurocentric one. The lack of diversity within the movement is problematic, and so is the way that it idealizes a lifestyle that's unrealistic for most people. Playing at being poor is expensive, and creators of cottagecore content are often financially well off, as we learned with the whole ballerina farm fiasco last month. Those of us who live in big cities and aren't in a financial position to buy land or a house, which is most of us if you're under 65, let's be real, are left to consume cottagecore as aspirational content. What's interesting is this is exactly how cottagecore began way back in the 18th century. The very gay historical roots of cottagecore. To truly understand cottagecore, we need to look at its historical roots that are surprisingly queer and deeply intertwined with a longing to return to nature. Let's start with the late 18th century, a time when there was a growing trend of escaping the chaos of urban life for the tranquility of the countryside. Sound familiar? That's because it is. If you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you know I like to blame Enlightenment philosophy for basically everything. So guess what? I'm going to blame it for cottagecore too. Except not really, because I actually really love cottagecore, at least the way it was meant to be, but I digress. class. For those of you who are new here or who, for whatever crazy reason, don't have a degree in philosophy, a brief overview of Enlightenment philosophy is basically that it's all about getting back to nature. It came about in the mid-17th century during a time of colonization when Europe was under the thumb of autocratic kings and European empires were expanding all over the globe, competing with each other for supremacy in the colonies. Colonization and Enlightenment philosophy were key parts of the Age of Reason, which directly followed the Renaissance. The Age of Reason was all about human reasoning and how science can help us discover certain objective truths about the world around us. Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau and Diderot were dedicated to rational analysis, and they were skeptical of the role that established religion had played in the way that societies had evolved. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was instrumental in promoting the idea that civilization corrupts natural human goodness. In his work Ami, or On Education, which was published in 1762, Rousseau argued that children should be raised in a natural environment, away from the corrupting influences of society. His famous statement, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," reflects his belief in the purity of nature and the harmful effects of civilization. This emphasis on returning to nature laid the groundwork for a pastoral ideal, which later influenced the aesthetics of cottagecore. The Enlightenment also saw a growing appreciation for the simplicity of rural life. This was in part a reaction against the complexities and perceived artificiality of living in the city and the emerging industrial society. Enlightenment thinkers idealized the countryside as a place of moral purity, simplicity, and self-sufficiency. This idealization of rustic life can be seen in the popularity of pastoral literature and art, which romanticized rural landscapes and the simple lives of shepherds and farmers. Marie Antoinette was famously enchanted by this idea, and in the late 1780s, she had a small rustic village known as the Hameau de la Reine, built on the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. Here, she and her friends would dress as shepherdesses and pretend to live simple pastoral lives, far removed from the political turmoil of the time. When we think of Marie Antoinette, images of opulence, extravagant fashion, and the turmoil of the French Revolution often come to mind. But beneath the surface of these historical portrayals is a much more complex figure, one who has become a queer icon deeply connected to the roots of what we now recognize as cottagecore. To really understand this connection, we need to embark on a bit of a side quest and delve into her life just a little bit, her passions, and the spaces she created as a form of escape from the rigid expectations of her role as Queen of France. Marie Antoinette, a queer icon in a pastoral fantasy. Marie Antoinette's fascination with rural life began as a way to escape the pressures of the French court. She had grown weary of the stifling etiquette, the constant scrutiny, and the lack of genuine human connection that defined life at Versailles at that time.
This is ridiculous.
This, madame, is Versailles.
So, in the late 1770s, she commissioned the construction of the Hameau de la Reine, a small rustic village on the grounds of Versailles. This wasn't just a whimsical project, it was a deliberate attempt to create a space where she could indulge in the fantasy of a simpler and more authentic existence. The Hameau de la Reine was designed to resemble a quaint, idealized version of a French peasant village. Here, Marie Antoinette and her close circle of friends would dress in simple pastoral clothing, tend to the gardens, milk cows, and play at being shepherdesses. This was more than just a diversion. It was an exploration of identity, a way for her to reclaim a sense of agency in a life where so much was controlled by others. Marie Antoinette's personal life has been the subject of speculation since the 1780s, particularly her close friendships with the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac, which were characterized by deep emotional intimacy and affection. Some historians have suggested that these relationships may have been romantic in nature, contributing to Marie Antoinette's status as a queer icon. While it's important to avoid projecting modern labels onto historical figures, it's clear that Marie Antoinette's relationships with women went beyond the typical friendships of her time. The 18th century was a period when romantic friendships between women were common and socially acceptable to a degree, but they were also complex and multifaceted. These relationships often involved intense emotional bonds, and in some cases, they may have included physical intimacy as well. I talked about this in detail in my video about how the Age of Reason ruined everything, so definitely go check it out if you're interested in this topic. I will leave a card somewhere on the screen above my head. For Marie Antoinette, her connections with these women provided an escape from the isolation and rigid expectations of her life as queen. The pastoral setting of the Hameau, where her and her friends spent so much time, allowed her to express a different side of herself, one that was more aligned with nature, simplicity, and emotional authenticity. Her fashion and aesthetic choices at the village reflected this shift as she traded the elaborate gowns and heavy makeup of court life for simple muslin dresses, straw hats, and minimal adornment. This aesthetic, which combined elements of rustic charm with a subtle subtle defiance of aristocratic norms, can be seen as a precursor to the cottagecore style we see today. This style is important to me because it had a lot to do with my own identity. I've been fascinated by the pastoral ephemera of Marie Antoinette's fantasy village life since I was a kid, and for me, the connection between cottagecore history and my queerness is deeply personal. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I taught myself to sew because I wanted to recreate a specific gown that Marie Antoinette wore, and that gown was the infamous chemise à la reine, which Marie Antoinette had made out of a light breezy cotton so that she could wear it at the hameau. It became a kind of uniform for her and her friends, and a symbol of deliberately luxurious simplicity in a world of opulence and rigidity. I wanted to know what it would be like to wear that dress, to move in it, to connect in some tangible way to that time and place that's always fascinated me so much. I did a whole video on the recreation of that gown a couple of years ago, and I'll link to it somewhere up on the screen as well. During COVID, I spent a lot of time sewing, which for me was a way to bring cottagecore into my life. It was right before I started realizing I'm queer, and looking back on that time now, I can see it was a way to unconsciously connect with being queer, even if I wasn't ready to consciously know it yet. It was also a way to connect with the past, both objectively speaking and subjectively, as I explored the roots of why I had always been so fascinated by this woman who died over 200 years ago, and gradually it started to all come together and make sense to me. Thanks, cottagecore. Side note, you might be gay if you've always been obsessed with Marie Antoinette and have no idea why. Marie Antoinette's embrace of the pastoral ideal was both a personal escape and a cultural statement. It challenged the rigid gender roles and expectations of her time, offering a vision of femininity that was more natural, playful, and free. This vision has resonated through the centuries, influencing everything from Romanticism in the 19th century to the modern cottagecore movement. Her legacy as a fashion icon and a symbol of resistance to societal norms is one reason she continues to be celebrated in queer culture today. In many ways, her life was a contradiction. She was a queen who longed to be a shepherdess, a public figure who craved privacy, and a woman who, despite her wealth and power, sought a simpler, more authentic existence. Her creation of the Hameau de la Reine was more than just a frivolous escape. It was a radical act of self-expression, one that allowed her to explore her identity and desires in a world that often left little room for such exploration. Today, as we see the rise of movements like cottagecore, it's fascinating to trace these ideals back to one of history's most enigmatic figures. Marie Antoinette's story is a reminder that the desire for simplicity, nature, and authenticity is not new. It's a timeless pursuit, one that continues to inspire and resonate with people today. Whether we see her as a misunderstood queen, a fashion icon, a rich woman cosplaying poverty, or a queer trailblazer, her influence on the way we think about identity, nature, and self-expression is undeniable. The cottagecore movement of today draws heavily from these 18th century ideals. The emphasis on pastoral life, simplicity, and a deep connection to nature can be seen as a modern reinterpretation of Enlightenment and Romantic themes. The nostalgia for an imagined, simpler past where one lives in harmony with nature is central to cottagecore, much as it was to Enlightenment and Romantic thought. Thus, the cottagecore movement's aesthetic and philosophical underpinnings are deeply rooted in 18th century Enlightenment ideas about nature, simplicity, and the virtues of rural life. Cottagecore and Romanticism in the 19th century. The cottagecore movement also has roots in the Romantic movement of the 1840s, which celebrated a return to rural life. The Romantic movement began in the late 18th century with Marie Antoinette and Enlightenment philosophy, and it peaked in the early to mid-19th century as a reaction to industrialization and urbanization. By this time, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, and all over Europe and North America, pristine countryside was being eaten up by railways and factories and farming machines. As people lost their jobs to automation and moved to big cities to seek out work and factories, there was a real longing to reconnect with nature, beauty, simplicity, and rural life. Sound familiar? As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The Romantic movement of the 19th century idealized rural life as a refuge from the corruption and complexities of urban and industrial life. This is evident in the literature, art, and music of the time, which frequently depicted idyllic rural landscapes, pastoral scenes, and the simple, virtuous lives of country folk. Thomas Hardy, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot all wrote books that took place in the countryside, and a whole genre of literature emerged that celebrated pastoral escapism while highlighting the very real impacts of industrialization and public policy on rural communities at the time. The Enclosure-Acts of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were of particular interest to Romantic writers. As land usage all over England was being renegotiated, small farms and farming communities were being destroyed to make way for privately owned farms and factories. The Enclosures-Acts took away the rights of local people to their ancestral lands and gave them alternatives that were smaller, of poorer quality, and often didn't afford access to water or wood. Some smaller villages were forced into changing how they lived because they had to adapt to the new land administered by the government. It's really important to understand that villagers at the time had a sense of identity that was rooted in a specific area and embedded in a web of familial and community relationships which had defined that place through generations. This sense of loss and trauma is what can be seen through the Romantic literature of the time, which expresses a desire to return to the simplicity and predictability of life before the Enclosure-Acts and industrialization. Romantic writers and painters were also fascinated by the power and beauty of nature, often portraying it as a source of inspiration, solace, and even spiritual renewal.
I wandered, lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils.
The concept of the sublime, which refers to the awe-inspiring, sometimes overwhelming beauty of nature, was central to Romantic art and literature. Cottagecore shares this deep appreciation for nature with its focus on natural beauty, wildflowers, forests, and pastoral settings. The movement often promotes sustainable and eco-friendly practices, reflecting a desire to live in harmony with the natural world again. The Romantic movement of the 1840s has profoundly influenced cottagecore's aesthetics and philosophy. Both movements celebrate a return to nature, an idealization of rural life, and a desire to escape from the complexities and anxieties of modern society. The visual and cultural elements of cottagecore, such as floral patterns, rustic cottages, and pastoral scenes, can be seen as modern manifestations of Romantic ideals reinterpreted for the 21st century. Romantic literature often expressed a nostalgia for a simpler pre-industrial past where life was more connected to nature and less dominated by mechanization and urbanization. This sense of nostalgia was linked to a critique of modern society, which was seen as being alienating and dehumanizing. In the mid-20th century, landdyke and lesbian self-sufficiency movements also expressed a form of nostalgia, not for a specific historical period, but for an imagined pre-patriarchal society where women lived in harmony with each other and the natural world. Landdykes and feminist resistance. To understand the deeper connection between cottagecore and queerness, we need to look at the landdyke movement from the 1970s and 1980s. This was a time when many lesbians and sapphic women sought to create lives that were completely independent from the patriarchal structures that dominated mainstream society. They weren't just looking for a new way of living, they were creating a revolution in how they defined community, identity, and survival. These women sought to create lesbian separatist communities in rural areas, living off the land and rejecting patriarchy and capitalism. These lesbian communities were often self-sustaining, with members engaging in agriculture, carpentry, and other forms of manual labor. They were driven by a desire to live in harmony with nature, to create a space where women could thrive without reliance on men or the capitalist economy. This wasn't just about survival, though. It was a political statement, a declaration of independence from a society that marginalized them. Landdykes were pioneers in their own right, carving out spaces where they could live according to their values, free from the constraints of mainstream society. They engaged in sustainable farming, built their own homes, and formed close-knit, supportive communities. This lifestyle wasn't just about survival. It was a political statement, a rejection of heteronormativity, and a celebration of lesbian identity. The movement was also about creating a sense of community that was deeply tied to feminist and lesbian identity. These women built networks of mutual support where every aspect of life, from food production to housing, was shared and managed collectively. They rejected the traditional nuclear family model, instead fostering a communal way of living where everyone contributed and benefited equally. It was closely aligned with with the concept of political lesbianism, which was a radical feminist theory of the time that encouraged women to prioritize relationships with other women as a form of resistance to patriarchal norms. This was about more than just sexual orientation. It was about solidarity, empowerment, and the creation of a culture that was entirely separate from male dominance. Living off the land was a way to put these ideas into practice and to create a tangible physical space where they could live out their politics and their values. Life in these communities wasn't easy. The work was hard, and many of these women had to learn new skills on the fly. But despite the challenges, or perhaps because of them, those communities were places of profound empowerment. They offered a vision of what was possible when women came together, lived according to their own values, and supported each other in a shared mission. The lesbian landdyke movements can be seen as a modern manifestation of romantic ideas, particularly those related to nature, individualism, and the critique of modern industrial society. Romantic literature provided a cultural and intellectual framework that supported the movement's values of autonomy, self-sufficiency, and a deep connection to the natural world. By drawing on earlier pastoral romanticism, landdykes were able to articulate a vision of a radically different way of life, one that rejected patriarchal norms and embraced a return to nature, community, and emotional authenticity. When I was doing research for this video, I came across a really fascinating video here on the YouTubes where a handful of older lesbians were talking about their experiences creating back to the land sapphic communities in the 1980s and 90s. It was really fascinating to hear about these women's experiences and how they worked together to create a life that was more aligned with their identities.
I loved the land of Minnesota where I lived with my lover at the time for 10 years, and yet I craved community, lesbian community, where we could get together, unfold a life as we know it can be, where we could understand and live a more organic, mutual, caring, earth-centered life.
My sister took me to the park. I hadn't started school yet. I was probably less than 6 years old. As we came out of the park, I yanked on her hand and I said, I pointed toward the park and I said, "You mean the whole world was like that?" And she said, "Yes." And then I pointed to the street and I said, "People on purpose made it like that?" And she said, "Yes." So that took care of the land part. The lesbian part sort of grew in the festival circuit, camping and bonding and learning and watching women help each other to develop skills. That is what brought the land thing and the women thing together for me.
My name is Frances Etherington. I'm 72 years old. I live at Rainbow's End Women's Land in Western Oregon. Rainbow's End is 57 acres. We are a state of Oregon mutual benefit nonprofit organization. The board of directors are the residents, and we were founded in 1975. There are 5 women who live here. We have actually a limit of 5 decision-making residents. We also have visitors and sometimes long-term visitors, sometimes really long-term visitors. We have a camping available, sometimes indoor space available for our visitors. At Rainbow's End, we all own all of the land, all the buildings, and we financially share in their upkeep. We have chickens, we have a garden. Our land has a wildlife enhancement project on it, which gives us a little property tax deduction. We each pay $125 a month to live here, which covers, utilities, taxes, farm equipment, building upkeep, road repair.
So my motivation really is not, it wasn't political at all at the time. Of course, everything we do is political, but it wasn't for lesbians. It wasn't those reasons. It was because I lived with a group of people on a 200-year-old farmhouse, and we had this was in the early 70s. We had goats and chickens and gardened and heated with wood and all that kind of stuff. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted the country, the garden, the animals, and a group of people, primarily because I would never be able to own land myself, never be able to buy it, and I wouldn't be able to do all the work involved. There's a lot of work, and besides that, it wouldn't be much fun by myself. Or I don't think it would be.
I'll link to it below. Definitely go check it out after this if you're interested in the landdyke movement and want to hear more about it. The relationship between modern cottagecore and lesbians is complex because cottagecore ended up co-opting a lot of sapphic culture and integrating it into its broader, more mainstream and often problematic aesthetic. Cottagecore borrows certain ideas and values from back to the land lesbians, particularly those related to nature, self-sufficiency, and rural living, and reinterprets them with the softer, less overtly political framework. The landdyke landdyke movement was particularly driven by a desire to escape patriarchal society and create a space where lesbians could live freely and authentically. This escape was not just physical, but also ideological, rejecting mainstream societal norms in favor of a more radical way of life. While cottagecore also taps into the idea of escape, it tends to be more about escaping the stresses of modern life in general. The movement is often centered on a generalized nostalgia for a simpler, idealized past, which can sometimes gloss over the real struggles and motivations that fueled the landdyke movement in the first place. For lesbians creating self-sufficient rural spaces, the emphasis was on community and cooperation, as well as on practical skills, survival, and living in harmony with nature, often in a context that was very intentionally radical. Cottagecore strips these things of their political and feminist implications and presents them as quaint, nostalgic pastimes rather than as radical acts of self-sufficiency and resistance. Cottagecore's appeal to a broader, often apolitical audience means that these radical ideas are softened or entirely absent, turning what was once a form of resistance into a more palatable lifestyle trend. The landdyke movement was also inherently anti-commercial, with a focus on self-sufficiency, bartering, and communal living. It was a rejection of mainstream consumer culture and a deliberate attempt to create an alternative way of life. In contrast, cottagecore has been widely commercialized, with brands and influencers selling everything from cottagecore fashion to home decor. This commercialization often dilutes the movement's original values, turning a lifestyle rooted in political and social critique into a consumer trend focused on aesthetics. The subsumption of elements from the landdyke movement by modern cottagecore influencers is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's brought some of the values associated with rural self-sufficient living into mainstream consciousness, and it's caused a lot of us to rethink our priorities and reimagine our relationships to work and labor. On the other hand, by stripping these things of their political and feminist context, cottagecore can obscure the radical origins and intentions of the lesbian landdyke movement, ending up at something really pretty and nice to look at, but ultimately stripped of its revolutionary potential. The cottagecore we know today as an internet aesthetic is in some ways more closely related to the cottagecore of Marie Antoinette's time because it's meant to be an escapist fantasy rather than a political statement. Whether she knew it or not, or meant it to be that way or not, Marie Antoinette's little landdyke experiment was inherently queer, and queerness is the thread that connects each iteration of cottagecore from its beginnings right up to now. While the landdyke movement may seem like a relic of the past, its influence can still be felt today, especially in queer communities that value sustainability, communal living, and a connection to nature. The history of the landdyke is a testament to the power of community, the importance of living in alignment with one's values, and the radical potential of queerness when it intersects with a deep intentional connection to the land. As we see cottagecore continue to evolve, it's important to remember these roots and the ways in which queer women have long used rural spaces as sites of resistance, empowerment, and transformation. Queerness as culture and sometimes as romance and sexuality. One of the things that bothers me most about how queer people are perceived is the way that straight people often reduce us to our sexualities and project a hypersexuality onto us that doesn't really exist. I mean, it can, and there's nothing wrong with that, but this idea that queer people equals deviant sex is just wrong and reductionist. Queerness is much more than sexual orientation or romantic relationships. It's a way of seeing the world, an entire culture that embraces difference, fluidity, and the breaking of norms. In the context of cottagecore, queerness isn't just about who you love. It's about how you live, create, and connect with the world around you. Queerness as culture means embracing a lifestyle that resists the assumptions and constraints of mainstream society. It's about creating spaces where people can be themselves without fear of judgment. In many ways, cottagecore provides a perfect backdrop for this, with its emphasis on simplicity, nature, and a rejection of consumerism and modern pressures. For many in the LGBTQIA+ community, cottagecore offers a sanctuary, a way to live authentically and in harmony with our surroundings. At its core, cottagecore is about imagining new possibilities for living, a theme that resonates deeply with queer culture. Queer people have often had to carve out our own spaces, both physically and culturally, to create communities where we can thrive. Whether it's through chosen families, safe spaces, or creative expression, queerness has always been about more than just sexuality. It's a whole different way of doing life. Going all the way back to Marie Antoinette's time, cottagecore has always been a way to explore queer romance in a setting that feels safe and nurturing. The gentle, idyllic environment that it evokes offers a kind of purity and simplicity that contrasts with the complexity and, at times, hostility of the outside world. This setting allows for the exploration of relationships in a way that feels both private and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature, which is exactly what embracing your queerness feels like. That first queer experience after coming out is so magical because for the first time in your life, you feel like sex and romance and all these things that had felt so stilted and awkward and constraining before are suddenly natural and pleasant and freeing. When I dated men, I was always having to overthink things, consciously telling myself how and when to touch my partner. When I finally got to do those things with someone who isn't male, I was surprised at how natural and no-brainer it actually was. It was like my body just knew what to do without having to consciously think about it for the first time in my life. The naturalness of cottagecore, at least for me, echoes the naturalness of those experiences. For me, it's a fantastic metaphor for escaping the unnaturalness and artificiality of heteronormativity and living much closer to nature, my own nature. But ultimately, as I said, it's not just about sex and romance. Queerness within the cottagecore movement often expresses itself through the creation of alternative family structures, communal living, and a focus on shared experiences. These are spaces where gender roles are fluid, where the binary norms of society don't apply, and where individuals can define their own ways of relating to each other. In these queer spaces, the act of living itself becomes a form of resistance. By embracing a lifestyle that prioritizes care, creativity, and connection, queer individuals are building lives that reflect their values and their identities, and they're doing it in a way that feels deeply satisfying and true to who they are. Ultimately, the integration of queerness into cottagecore speaks to a broader cultural shift, one that values diversity, inclusivity, and the freedom to live authentically. It's a reminder that aesthetics and lifestyle choices are never just about what's on the surface. They're also about what they represent and the communities they help to build. And of course, whenever we have broader cultural shifts, especially towards things that are different, there's always a backlash. The co-opting of cottagecore by far-right influencers. In recent years, far-right influencers have attempted to co-opt cottagecore, twisting its ideals to fit their own agendas. The far-right often promotes a return to traditional values and roles, including a focus on family, nationalism, and gender roles that align with their conservative views. They use the cottagecore aesthetic to reinforce their vision of a nostalgic, idealized past, often at the expense of diversity and inclusivity. Christian conservative influencers like Ballerina Farm use cottagecore aesthetics to glorify slow living and homemaking as traditionally feminine labor in a strictly gendered relational context. These influencers are subverting the original intention of cottagecore and using it to promote traditional marriage and gender roles, encouraging heteronormativity in a context that was specifically created in order to get away from it.
Kia ora, here's a day in my life as a cottagecore mum. I like to start with a sunrise in bed and work on my rug, and then off to the garden to feed the chooks and the ducks. I get ready for some baking. I love ruffles, so many ruffles.
When Jake and I got married about 2 years ago, I did not have a deep desire for homemaking. If anything, I dreaded the chores. I dreaded the dishes. I dreaded the laundry. I dreaded having to vacuum the house and clean the toilet. And I think the hardest part for me was that I knew that I would have to do it all again the next day. So I started praying about this, and I asked the Lord to change my view on homemaking. I asked Him to change my attitude towards stewarding my home, and He did. He gave me a new perspective on it. I asked Him to help these little things to bring me joy, and now they do. Even though it's still hard work, and sometimes I really don't enjoy, well, most of the time, I really don't enjoy cleaning the toilet. There's so much joy in stewarding your home well, and I'm just so thankful for a place that I can call home.
Cottagecore's celebration of traditional rural life and its romanticization of historical simplicity is being co-opted to support far-right narratives about returning to a perceived better past, emphasizing conservative values and rejecting modernity. Cottagecore's connection to the land and its original intention of pushing back against land enclosures is being taken to a whole other level by far-right nationalists who have co-opted the aesthetic to emphasize ethnic connection to specific lands. Far-right cottagecore influencers often employ identity identity politics to create exclusionary communities that promote a narrow vision of who belongs based on race, ethnicity, and traditional gender roles. In some cases, far-right groups have adapted cottagecore's focus on rural traditional living to promote exclusionary ideas about who is authentically part of their vision of the countryside. This can manifest in efforts to portray certain rural spaces as belonging to specific ethnic or national groups to the exclusion of others. Tradwives in particular are big on cottagecore, and while being a tradwife in and of itself isn't inherently extremist, as I've discussed in previous videos, it definitely can be a conduit for involvement in extremist activities. Cottagecore and fascism have in common the glorification of a sanitized and fictional past, one which ignores the realities and struggles of actual humans who have actually had to live off the land, both because they had no choice, as in the case of a mid-18th century peasant, and in the case of the land lesbians, who toiled hard for their politics and values. This co-opting of cottagecore is a reminder of how easily cultural movements can be distorted and used to serve harmful ideologies. My thoughts on cottagecore. Personally, I have always loved and always will love cottagecore as an interior design choice, a fashion statement, an expression of my queer identity and love of history, and as an escapist fantasy. But the keyword here is fantasy. I acknowledge the problematic nature of cottagecore, and I also understand the very deep roots of those problems. They've always been there since the beginning of the pastoral fantasy that was created by Enlightenment philosophy. I also know that cottagecore is a fantasy. It's not and never has been an authentic representation of life in the countryside, and I think the biggest problems with it come from a lack of understanding around this. When we take aesthetics that seriously, when we build our lives and our online presence around them without first taking the time to understand where they come from, who they exclude, and how they can potentially be used to further hate and harm, we're not engaging with them responsibly. This is not to blame or shame anyone who likes to get lost in a TikTok feed now and again, don't we all? It's just meant to remind us that critical thinking is always important, as is the ability to separate reality from fantasy. That's going to do it, my loves. I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I hope you learned something new or just had something pleasant to listen to in the background while you work. I'll see you all in the next one. Toodaloo.